In the last section, we began discussing the concept of state in React. Remember, state is a plain JavaScript object that exists on any component that's a class-based component. Each instance of a class-based component has its own copy of state. We initialize the state by defining the constructor method and setting the state as this.state inside of it. We decided the name of this first property that we're going to use is term, but the names of these properties aren't forced on us. We could use any different property name that we want, and you'll see that here very shortly. In this section, we're going to continue making use of state by recording the value of our input on the state. To do so, we're going to need to update our state inside of this function handler right here. So instead of doing a console log, we're going to update our state. Updating the state is a little bit different than creating it, and it's really important to recognize the difference. So in our constructor, we said this.state equals object. This constructor function is the only time we will ever see code that looks like this right here to manipulate our state. And this is probably the bar number one thing that I want you to take away from this course is making sure that you understand how to manipulate state. So only inside of the constructor function do we change our state like this by just saying this.state equals blah. Everywhere else inside of all of our components, we, instead of using this.state equals, we'll use a method called this.setState. So let's delete our console log here, and we're going to replace this with this.setState. And we pass an object that contains the new state that we want to give our component. So I'll pass it an object that has a term, and the value is going to be the new value of the input, which is event.target.value, like so. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and let's talk about this one more time just in review, just so I make sure I drive it home. In the constructor, we said this.state equals an object. Everywhere else inside of our component, to change our state, we use this.setState. So we should never have something that looks like this.state.term equals event.target.value. Bad. Never do that. We always manipulate our state with this.setState. Using setState is what really allows us to maintain continuity. Behind the scenes, React is doing a tremendous amount of stuff with a state object. And so if we just change the value, well, React doesn't really know that the value changed. So instead, we use this method to inform React, hey, the state's changing, and here's what the new state is. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this and flip on over, refresh, and you'll see we can still type just fine. Nothing really changes here. Well, so what's the side effects here of recording state? Why are we doing this at all? What do we get out of this? Well, I'll show you. Let's add a little bit more to this input component. I'm going to put the input on a new line, and we'll wrap our JSX with some parentheses. Don't forget the semicolon at the end, like so. And we'll add a div around the input. And then we'll put some plain text in here. We'll say value of the input. And then we're going to reference a JavaScript variable inside of our JSX. And if you remember earlier, I said I'm going to mention this many times. Whenever we reference a JavaScript variable, we wrap it with curly braces inside of JSX. So inside of here, we'll write this.state.term. Notice that I'm writing this.state.term because I'm not modifying the value of term. I'm just referencing it. I'm just saying, hey, here's what the value is. So it's okay to write this.state.term to reference it, just never do something like this.state.term equals 5 or 4 or what have you. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and let's see what happens when we re-render this now. Okay, so I've got value of the input, and I'm going to start typing. Awesome. So as I type, the text is showing up after value of the input as well. So what's this tell us? Let's flip back over to our code here. So whenever we update the input element, whenever we change the value of it, this function right here runs because it's our event handler. We set the state, this.state.term, with the new value of the input. Whenever we update our state, whenever we call this.setState, it causes our component to automatically re-render and push all the updated information from the render method into the DOM. Because our render method makes reference to this.state.term, every time that the component re-renders, we get the updated this.state.term in the DOM. So that is like the full circle of state. I'm convinced that as time goes on, state's going to seem kind of confusing, but if you condense it all down to this very simple example right here, it starts to make a lot more sense. Basically, whenever we want to update our component in some fashion, be thinking state. Okay, so this looks good right here. I'm going to go ahead and remove this value of the input right here because we're not going to need this. We'll leave the div right now though. We'll probably use it for styling later on. So I'm going to save this. Let's refresh, make sure everything still works. Yep, looks good. Okay, let's wrap up state with a final review in the next section.